Welcome to Lecture 13. With this lecture, we begin a new theme, life in its past. We're leaving the Enlightenment period behind and beginning our sojourn into the new century. Oh, we'll linger just a bit in the years around the turn of the century. As you know from the last lecture, we've already gotten into the subject of living things during these transition years from the old century to the new. For example, last time we saw how the new science of electricity became involved with life itself, and what an impression that link between electricity and life made. Luigi Galvani's claim that there was animal electricity was regarded by some as so sensational that it superseded even the accomplishments of people like Galileo and Newton. I mentioned how it was not long before the intimate link between electrical force and life itself was exploited. Specifically, Mary Shelley's story of Frankenstein brought the issue to the attention of the reading public when she used an electrical discharge to bring Dr. Frankenstein's monster to life. So now we're going to forge on ahead, and we're going to focus on this thing called life. We already know how important the decades around the turn of the century were. In a couple of the past lectures, I've talked about how these were the years, and I mean the years particularly between, say, 1780 all the way up to around 1840, when a new awareness was coming about. It had to do with the gradual appearance of a recognized practitioner of natural science, with the emergence of a scientific community and of acknowledged spokesmen to natural science, or for natural science. It had to do with the appearance of new institutions of natural science. It had to do with a growing consensus about what it meant to be scientific. Now, 1780 to 1840 is a long period of time. The emergence of something that looks more like the natural science of today, even once it got underway, didn't happen overnight. This era of transition was marked with a lot of twists and turns, and we'll be examining some of them. Along the way, you'll see glimmerings of things that look quite familiar to you as marks of natural science, but don't make the mistake of thinking that they're exactly the same conceptions that scientists today endorse, or even that all the natural philosophers of this time shared the same fundamental outlook. They didn't. We're going to run across some perspectives that will make clear how contested the meaning of natural science was during this formative period of the early decades of the 19th century. Let me take a moment to give you something of a roadmap of the territory ahead in this set of lectures on life in its past. Then we'll commence with our investigation of today's subject, which is about the birth of the new science of biology. Well, here's a quick overview of the subjects we'll be looking at. In a moment, we'll see how at the beginning of the era, natural philosophers came up with a new way of regarding living things that required novel forms of knowledge. And this gave rise to that new science, the science of something called biology. And the study of living things was not the only context in which an innovation in perspective occurred. A whole new organic approach to nature emerged. Accompanying it came a call from its advocates for a creative vision about what natural science should be. There may not have yet been a consensus on what natural science was, but there were plenty of folks who had ideas on that issue. And when some became very creative with their fundamentally organic view, it stirred the pot. We'll follow all that during the century's early years. Then we'll spend 3 lectures exploring European encounters with prehistoric life. What was speculated about by the 18th century theorists of the Earth concerning the earliest forms of life on our planet suddenly took on a very different color when the world of prehistoric beasts started showing up in museums and lecture halls. Fossil remains of large animals captivated the European mind. And it also gave rise, during the first 3 decades of the 19th century, to new speculations about the development of life. How did these beasts come to be? And what did they mean for our understanding of ourselves? Along with this topic, we'll uncover a famous controversy about the Earth's past, a holdover from the discussion of the theories of the Earth that we looked at back in the 18th century. It pitted the so-called Vulcanists against the Neptunists, and it became a somewhat celebrated episode in history of science. I'll do my best to give you the latest take that historians have on it. As new vistas appeared to open, some naturalists decided that they needed to know more about the world of their own day, specifically the parts of the Earth and its life that were unknown to Europeans and largely still unexplored by them. There had been lots of explorers prior to the 19th century, but we're going to look at two who focused specifically on natural philosophy in their journeys. And then after that, we'll discuss the appearance of a sensational book that hit the press in England in 1844. It tried to summarize how the latest natural science challenged the traditional understanding of humankind's place in nature. To make it more enticing, it was written anonymously, and it rocked England. At the same time this was happening, the young Charles Darwin, who was one of the explorers I mentioned a minute ago, was back from his voyage of discovery and was quietly preparing another bombshell for the age. We'll examine, of course, the origin of species, and we'll take several lectures to look at some of the scientific, political, social, and religious fallout from that publication that played itself out over the remainder of the 19th century. On the way, we'll take a look as well at the important work of Louis Pasteur in France, whose efforts not only bore on the question of life's origin, but also on how to curb some of its lethal enemies. So, that's what's immediately ahead for us. Let's turn now to the question of the day, the birth of biology. As I said earlier, I want in this lecture to see how the question of life gave rise to a fundamentally new viewpoint among natural philosophers. Let me begin by drawing on something that a famous historian and philosopher once said. This was the French thinker Michel Foucault. I've already referred to him in Lecture 9 when I cited his claim that these years around the turn of the 19th century marked the time when the firm web of our modern existence began to take shape. Well, Foucault also said, again referring to this time, that life did not exist before the 19th century. All that existed were living beings. Now that's an odd thing to say. What could he possibly mean by it? Obviously, he's trying to get our attention here. Foucault meant that in what was known as natural history in the 18th century, living beings took their place alongside other natural entities to be classified. The fact that they were living wasn't intrinsically significant. All that did was to supply the reason why they could be grouped together. Minerals were grouped together in the older tradition of natural history because they were non-living. The goal of natural history in the 18th century, according to Foucault, was to incorporate living things and non-living things into a larger order, to create a taxonomy of all being. In this scheme, there was nothing more special about living things than non-living things. Now, Foucault said that this mode of understanding changed around the turn of the 19th century. A new understanding emerged, in which living things became something more than objects to be classified together. They manifested a special feature. They were alive. Living things were something qualitatively different from everything else. Now, life existed. Living things were no longer just something to be sorted and arranged. So if we were natural philosophers here, we're focused in on this special feature, this unique quality. It's as if we've awakened to its presence. Now that we're aware of it, we want to know more about it. We're not satisfied that life could be understood simply by classifying its many forms. There's something more here that's caught our interest. Now the understanding of this new thing called life required new forms of knowledge. The old natural history just didn't suffice. And it's in the creation of these novel forms of knowledge that a new science of life, biology, emerged. The very word biology was coined by no less than 4 different individuals in the early years of the 19th century. That's pretty telling right there. Something's happening if a new word for the science of life, a word that draws on ancient Greek linguistic roots, crops up multiple times within a few years of each other. Well, as I said, biology differed from natural history in a fundamental way. Natural history sought to understand through classification by organizing the diversity of living things. That's not the goal in this new science that's emerging. Biology sought to understand the unique features that living things possessed by regarding these features as manifestations of natural laws. It's the old quest of bringing nature under the control of law, of natural law. The difference here is that the laws are new laws. These laws pertain to the subject, the special quality that the objects of the study in biology have, that they're alive. These will be laws that refer to this special feature. These will be thought of as higher laws. That's because they either don't exist among non-living things, or they're hard to see if you confine your attention to just the inanimate world. Well, what laws are we talking about here? The context in which life was subjected to law occurred in the aftermath of the Haller-Wulff debates, which we examined earlier in Lecture 8. That had to do, you'll recall, with the question about how the embryo developed. Albrecht Haller had claimed that the embryo contained preformed adults, which then essentially expanded mechanically as the embryo grew. That solved the problem of how the process was directed. We called this position the theory of preformation. The opposing theory at the time was something called epigenesis. Its major defender was Caspar Friedrich Wolff, who claimed that the embryo developed to its adult form from a previously unorganized mass. Now, a consensus emerged among German thinkers in the waning decades of the 18th century that the embryo developed from a formless mass, as Wolff had said. Epigenesis was in, preformation was out. But that didn't mean that all the questions surrounding this issue had been answered. There were still some that were unclear. For example, how exactly did the development of the embryo proceed according to the epigeneticists? Wolff had tried his hand at answering this, you may remember. But when describing how the development occurred, he referred only in general to the process of the solidification of fluids. Neither he nor anyone else identified the specific regularities in how the epigenetic development proceeded. What guided the way in which the solidification occurred? It couldn't occur randomly, or you wouldn't necessarily get any organized adult, to say nothing of the fact that you wouldn't get the adult form you were supposed to. What guided the development of a chicken embryo into an adult chicken? This is a difficult philosophical problem. We've seen that in the 18th century, natural philosophers were trying to come up with naturalistic accounts of phenomena that they were trying to explain. They didn't want to just give up and say, well, this one's too tough. We're just going to have to say that God is responsible for doing this, and that's the end of it. Now, they wanted to identify natural processes that God had used in creating and sustaining the world. But if there was ever a case where they might have been tempted to give up, this one, involving the development of the embryo, might be the one. But they didn't give up. They were convinced that natural processes were involved in the development of the embryo, and they were determined to figure them out. Incidentally, the word they used for the natural development of the embryo was evolution. Now, I know that sounds French, but it's actually the German word that was used. I suppose we could translate evolution into English directly as evolution, but I think that might confuse things too much because our modern use of the word evolution would tempt us to read a different meaning into what they meant. So I'm going to use the word development and reserve the word evolution for our usual meaning when we come to it later. Now, as the 18th century was drawing to a close, the German natural philosophers began to explore the natural development of life outside the narrower context of the development of the embryo. They began to ask about the notion of the development of life in general. This more general exploration of life in its past meant that these German scholars were open to new possibilities where living things were concerned. They had come to the conclusion that the history of all life in general in the past was not a haphazard affair, but what had guided it. In a sense, it was the same problem they had with the embryo, but writ larger. This is a good point for us to consider the work of one particular German natural philosopher from around the time of the turn of the 19th century. This is a man named Carl Friedrich Kielmayer. He undertook these questions in a very creative way. He attempted to explore a science of life through an investigation of organic forces. We're going to have to see what that meant, organic forces, but first let me tell you a little bit about Kielmayer. He taught in an unusual institution of higher learning, the Karlsschule near Stuttgart. It was the pet project of Grand Duke Karl Eugen of Württemberg. He'd been frustrated in his attempts to revitalize the flagging university at Tübingen, so he established a school of his own design in the 1770s, and it produced a number of important natural philosophers of the early 19th century. We'll meet another one, Georges Cuvier, in Lecture 15. Well, Kielmayer had been a student here, and then he had come back as a professor in the early 1790s. And in February of 1793, the young Professor Kielmayer addressed an assembly at the Karlsschule with a lecture entitled On the Relations of Organic Forces Among Each Other. This turned out to be a very important talk, not only for what it contained, but also because it proved to be inspiring for a number of other people. Kielmayer insisted that living things possessed organic forces that were unique. Take, for example, what he called the force of irritability. That enabled living things to react to stimuli. That wasn't something that rocks did. These organic forces, Kielmayer said, couldn't be described quantitatively like those governing non-living masses. They weren't like Newton's laws. To try to capture organic forces in a quantitative formula would miss something essential about their meaning. Once he had defined the basic idea of his organic forces, Kielmayer then did something else. He explored the scope of their operation. In particular, he suggested that organic forces operated on different levels, parallel levels, and they did this simultaneously. Now, we need to look closer at this. What did he mean by parallel levels and simultaneously? Well, for example, he argued that the operation of organic forces governing species was the same as that governing the developmental states of the individual. Now, that's an interesting notion. Let's unpack it a little more. Take a complex living thing, say a higher mammal. Kielmayer asserted that an individual mammal passed through stages of increasing complexity in its development. Clear enough. That was the problem we discussed before regarding the embryo. That was the position of the epigeneticist, that the embryo went from a state of no organization to one of highly complex organization as it developed. And since epigenesis had become the dominant view, so far Kielmayer wasn't saying anything new. The new part came when he said, oh, and incidentally, a similar sequence of increasing complex stages can be seen in the arrangement of species in the scale of being. What did that mean? Kielmayer explained, for example, that in the earliest stages of the growth of birds, when the embryo is simple, birds don't exhibit irritability. That's the organic force I mentioned earlier that enabled living things to respond to stimuli. Bird embryos don't display a response to stimuli. Now, in the scale of being, the simpler species, for example, plants, also don't exhibit irritability. Kielmayer was taking a bold step here. He was suggesting that the characteristics of simple species in the scale of being mirrored characteristics of the early stages of animal embryos. Simplicity in the scale of being had a counterpart in the simple stages of individual development and vice versa. The general conclusion Kielmayer came to was that animals higher in the scale of being passed through stages of individual development that paralleled the stages of the ascending scale of being itself. Now, we know that the scale of being ran from the simplest forms at the bottom to the most complex at the top. So, if you had become familiar with this scale, so that you knew what made one organism more complex than the one below it, and less complex than the one above it, then you'd realize that the same kind of increasing complexity is reflected in the epigenetic development of individual embryos of higher organisms. What you can see happen as you move up the scale of being also happens in the development of embryos of higher organisms. This is all very interesting, of course, but was he saying that the two kinds of development were related? Or was he just saying that the way the species are arranged in the great chain of being, the way, say, God created them to be at the original creation, just happens to be similar to the way the embryos of higher organisms develop? Is he just saying that the way the great chain of being has similarities to the way some embryos develop? It's more than that. Kielmeyer was willing to suggest, especially after the turn of the new century, that what you had in both cases was a single law of development. It was realized on the level of the individual and on the level of the species. That meant, of course, that species too had developed. When he spoke about another of the forces he thought was unique to living things, this time a reproductive force, he said the following: the reproductive force, as it operated in the individual, agrees in its laws with that force through which the series of different organizations of the earth were called into existence. That's a mouthful, I realize. What he's saying here is that the scale of being itself developed in epigenetic stages just like those evident in the embryo. He came to believe that this development had actually occurred in history, that there had been an actual evolution of life from lower to higher forms. We've seen evolution implied before, in De Molay, for example. He never said more than that it had happened. Kielmeyer was saying that there was a law being followed when it happened, and we can get a clue to this law from the way the embryo develops. After the turn of the century, there were a few who developed these ideas further into what eventually became known as the theory of recapitulation. Several German natural philosophers noted that the fetal development of higher animals passes through or recapitulates the organizational stages of classes below it. So in recapitulation, the fetal development of higher animals passes through the organizational stages of animals below them. One of these men was Johann Friedrich Meckel in Halle, where Caspar Friedrich Wolff had been. Meckel took his thinking on the matter right to the top of the scale of being. In 1806, he studied human fetuses, 6 of them in various ages. His conclusion? Well, here's what he said. The human fetus in its development indicates the stages at which lower animals have remained throughout their lives. That is, the development of the human fetus passes through all the stages that living things below it occupy. 2 years after Meckel published, a physiology professor, Friedrich Tiedemann, observed that at 5 months, the eye of the human embryo resembled that of a fish. It's as if the development of humans contains within it a record of the development of life up to humans. As we develop, we pass through all the stages that animals lower than we are have passed through. Let's notice a couple of things here. First, look how intimately this associates and links humans with other animals. Admittedly, we're talking about the physical characteristics of humans, not their uniqueness as conscious beings or their very special moral capabilities. You could always argue that however much humans were like animals, they were unlike animals in these mental and moral capacities. But you can imagine that once they understood what was being said, there would be plenty of folks who would object on religious grounds. Actually, it wasn't that easy to figure out exactly what was implied by these natural philosophers. They often couched their conclusions in highly philosophical language that seemed to leave them a lot of room to maneuver, so you couldn't always be sure of their meaning. But be that as it may, it was obvious that there was too close a link between humans and animals for most readers. And it surely was a far cry from what the average person understood about the history of humankind. For one thing, it implied, depending on how you read it, that humans had an ancient history, far older than anything people were used to. Now, a second thing about this development in German natural philosophy that we should be careful to note was its similarity and difference to past trends we've observed. It was like one trend we've seen frequently up to this point, That's the trend to subject nature to natural law whenever possible. Now, where the development of life was concerned, past attempts to do this were very speculative ventures. De Molay and Buffon pretty much simply asserted that life had developed, or degenerated, as Buffon would have it, to the forms that we see today. And then they left it there. They didn't say how, or really even why. Well, there's a suggestion in both that it was a matter of adaptation to new conditions, that life was just trying to survive, but that's where it ended. Here things were quite a bit different. Recapitulation theory emphasized the conviction that life itself was governed by natural laws. Remember, we're into an era that focused on life as something unique, unlike the operations of the heavens, for example. And what Kielmeyer and others are asserting is that this new object of attention, life, which didn't exist prior to the 19th century according to Foucault, life follows the rule of law. In fact, there is one law of life at work. It's a law that governs life at all levels, the development of the individual and the development of the species that make up the scale of being. Of course, Kielmeyer, Meckel, Tiedemann, and others all felt that they hadn't just thought this up. They believed that the realization about this one law resulted from the careful empirical work they had all done in their laboratories. Kielmeyer was a master in the laboratory. Meckel and Tiedemann took their cue from careful observations and comparisons of the development of fetuses and the study of the species that occupied the scale of being. Recapitulation theory was based on empirical work, but clearly the theory also functioned to do something else for them as well. It answered the old question that the epigeneticists had always had: if development had gone from a state in which matter was not organized to one which was highly organized, what guided the development? Preformationists didn't have that problem, since the embryo for them didn't start from a disorganized state. But epigeneticists did have the problem, and recapitulation theory helped here. It showed that life followed laws just as the heavens do, but the laws of life were not the same as those of the heavens. Life had its own laws, they said, and we're just beginning to get a grasp on them. And it's more than just the fact that life has its own laws. The kind of law has a deeper meaning than the laws of nature that have been discovered up to this point. The laws of life reflect nature's inner purposefulness. That was something very new. Nature has an inner purposefulness all by itself. How do embryos know what they're supposed to develop into? How does a fish embryo know to develop into a fish, a pig embryo into a pig, a human embryo into a human? Because the embryo merely follows the rule of a law that has the capacity to realize nature's purposes. And in realizing its grand purpose, nature accomplished a lot of individual purposes along the way. In bringing life to its highest stages of complexity, the law of development produced various individual stages of complexity, including fish, pigs, and humans. Now, of course, this could sound pretty dangerous to some people. It could come across as materialism. And in fact, it did come across that way to many who finally figured out what these natural philosophers were saying. Why? Well, consider the laws of physics. No one claimed that the mechanical laws of physics were themselves purposeful. They might reflect the higher purpose God had in instituting them, but that was God's purpose, not an inner purpose of the laws themselves. This was the same for the preformationists. God had imposed the original organization on the embryo, which thereafter expanded according to mechanical laws. This was different. They were saying that nature had its own inner purpose. It didn't need an external source for nature's purpose. It had its own. No wonder there were cries of materialism. No wonder many, especially those outside Germany, called this view atheistic. We'll see in Lecture 22 that the specter of this German natural philosophical tradition, in which nature itself was responsible for life, affected Louis Pasteur directly. He was motivated, in large measure, to oppose the materialism he saw inherent in the idea of spontaneous generation, which these Germans defended. The birth of biology as the new science that subjected life to natural law was one indication of the presence of a different vision of natural science at the beginning of the new century. We're entering here into the sequel to the Enlightenment, a period known as the Romantic era. This different vision of natural science emphasized organism over mechanism. Here the metaphor for nature itself was not a machine. Nature was a living organism. With this alternative vision, we encounter what has been called romantic science, and we'll examine that more closely in the next lecture.